She was 19 years old, and she owned exactly $2 and a carpet bag with a broken latch. The man who had put her out was not a villain in the way that stories usually require, he was simply her uncle, Harlan Greer, a cautious and contracted man who had decided. 6 weeks after her mother's burial, that feeding a niece who could not yet pay her own way was an arrangement that no longer suited the arithmetic of his household. He said it plainly, the way a farmer announces a killing frost, not with cruelty, exactly, but without apology. She had a week. She used 5 of those days to grieve and 2 to pack. When she walked out of his door in the copper-colored morning of a September Thursday in 1887, she carried 43 cents in one pocket. $1.57 stitched into the hem of her coat, and the name of a burned ranch house 6 miles east of the town of Sable Creek, Wyoming, which a land agent had mentioned in passing as something the county was prepared to let go, the whole scorched parcel, for the sum of $2, just to be rid of the paperwork. People in town said it was a fool's purchase. They said the Alderholt place had been cursed since the fire, that nothing would ever grow straight on that land again. And that whatever had survived the burning wasn't worth the bother of reclaiming. She bought it anyway, on a windy Tuesday morning, and signed her name in a ledger that smelled of mildew and pipe smoke. What those people did not know, what she herself would not know for several weeks yet, was that inside what remained of that ranch house, behind a wall that the fire had sealed rather than consumed, there was a room that had never been opened. And inside that room was something that did not belong to the ashes. It belonged to the whole of Sable Creek, and its discovery would undo a decade of quiet theft and return to the valley what had been taken from it, one careful truth at a time. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Alderholt. If you are watching from a place that feels abandoned, a place others have written off and moved on from, tell us about it in the comments. You may be surprised how many of us are keeping you company there. Nora's people had come to Wyoming from Pennsylvania in the year she turned 4. And she remembered almost nothing of the journey except the smell of the canvas wagon cover when it rained and the sound of her father singing to keep the horses calm on a particularly narrow mountain pass. Her father, Edmund Alderholt, was a man built for open country, wide-shouldered, slow-spoken, with hands that seemed to understand wood and stone the way a musician understands pitch. He had not come west to get rich. He had come because a valley surveyor's pamphlet described the Sable Creek Basin as a place where a man could build something permanent. And permanence was what Edmund Alderholt wanted more than almost anything on earth. He chose his acreage deliberately, walking the whole of it on foot before he ever drove a stake, learning where the water ran in spring and where the wind came in hardest from the northwest. So that when he finally raised the walls of the ranch house, he raised them in the one orientation that would hold heat in January and stay cool in August. He built slowly, over 2 full years, cutting his own timber and learning from a Shoshone carpenter named Follows the Creek the proper way to notch a corner log so it would not shift in a freeze. Nora grew up watching her father build, and without meaning to, she absorbed everything he did. She understood joinery before she understood arithmetic. She knew which wood would warp and which would hold. She could look at a wall and tell you where it was under stress. Her mother, Clara, contributed a different kind of knowledge. Clara had been a bookkeeper's daughter in Philadelphia, and she had grown up surrounded by ledgers and columns of figures. And she carried that precision into the ranch the way another woman might carry a cherished quilt. The Alderholt household kept records of everything: feed costs, rainfall, the number of days between first frost and first thaw, the prices paid for cattle in each of 4 consecutive years. Clara taught Nora that a number honestly recorded was a small act of justice, because it could not be argued with later. Numbers, Clara said, were the one language that did not allow for vanity. You either had the figures, or you did not. Nora was 12 when her father died of a septic wound he had been too proud to show anyone until it was too late. She was 17 when her mother's lungs, worn down by 2 Wyoming winters spent nursing a sick husband and then a sick grief, finally surrendered to a rattling pneumonia that the Sable Creek doctor said he had done everything he could to prevent. In the 2 years between her father's death and her mother's, Nora had already begun taking small bookkeeping jobs for the merchants along Sable Creek's 2-block Main Street, tidy, meticulous work that the merchants appreciated but paid poorly, because they did not yet understand that meticulous work was the most valuable kind. After her mother died, she moved into her Uncle Harlan's house on the edge of town with the understanding that she would contribute to the household by keeping his accounts and helping with the kitchen garden. It was not a generous arrangement, but she had accepted it with her father's particular brand of quiet dignity, the kind that does not perform itself for others. And she had done her work there faithfully for 2 years. The garden had produced well. The accounts had been accurate. She had asked for nothing. She had been given, accordingly, nothing, and then, at the end of September 1887, she had been given less than that. The eviction did not come without warning, if she was honest with herself. She had felt it building through the long, sour summer, the way you feel a change in a river's current before you see it. Harlan Greer was not a cruel man, as we have said, but he was a man who kept a careful account of what things cost him, and a 19-year-old niece who was not yet paying her own rent represented in his private arithmetic, a liability that was slowly outweighing her usefulness. His wife, Dovey, was a thin, efficient woman who had never been unkind to Nora outright, but who had begun, in recent months, to speak of the future in a way that subtly excluded her, plans for the spare room, remarks about the cost of an extra place at the table. Questions about whether Nora had made any friends who might be in a position to help her get established. Nora had answered these questions honestly and without self-pity, and she had not complained. But she had also begun, quietly, to prepare. She had saved every cent of the meager earnings from her bookkeeping work that Harlan did not require her to contribute to household expenses. She had taken stock of her skills with the same precise eye her mother had taught her to turn on a column of figures. She had made a list, literal, on paper, in her careful hand, of what she knew how to do: keep accounts, read a structural plan, identify poor joinery, tend a kitchen garden, cure leather in a pinch, and cook for a household of any size on a budget that would make a lesser cook despair. When the eviction came, she was as ready for it as a person can be for a blow they have seen coming. That is to say, not remotely ready, but not destroyed. The $2 she spent on the Alderholt land were, she understood clearly, either the wisest or most reckless thing she had ever done. It was her mother's parcel of stitched hem coins that paid for it, an inheritance so small it was almost an insult, and yet it was the only thing her mother had been able to leave her. And she spent it on her father's burned land with a feeling she could not name, something between fury and homecoming. The land agent, a soft man named Prescott who smelled of bay rum and looked at her with the particular species of pity reserved for young women making obviously desperate decisions, recorded the transaction and stamped the deed and handed it to her across the counter as if he were handing her a dead bird. She took it with both hands and thanked him and walked out into the wind. The ranch house, when she reached it, was worse than she had allowed herself to imagine. 3 of the 4 walls still stood, but one had buckled inward at its upper corner, and the roof was entirely gone, just the raw, charcoal tops of the wall plates open to the Wyoming sky. The interior was a landscape of ash and collapsed timber and the occasional ghostly artifact that the fire had chosen, for mysterious reasons of its own, to leave intact: a cast-iron pot, 1 blue enamel cup, a square of oilcloth that had somehow not caught. She stood in what had been the main room for a long time without speaking. Then she did what her father would have done. She walked the perimeter of the structure slowly, touching the walls, reading them the way he had taught her to read any piece of construction, not with her eyes first, but with her palms. It was during this slow, deliberate circuit that she noticed the east wall. It did not feel right. She had grown up in this house, had run her small hands along these walls 1,000 times as a child. And she knew, she was almost certain she knew, that the east wall was not as deep as it now appeared. She measured it by pacing, 10 steps along the inside, but only 7 along the outside. She stood very still and looked at the wall's surface, which was blackened but structurally solid, and she thought about the way her father had built, slowly, deliberately. with a purpose for every choice he made. There was no door in that wall. There had never been a door in that wall, not on the inside. But she began to believe, with the certainty that comes not from logic but from something older and deeper than logic, that there was a room behind it. She did not break through immediately. She had neither the tools nor, frankly, the courage for it in that first week. Instead, she made the property livable in the most basic sense, which required all of the energy she possessed. She patched the buckled wall corner with timber she salvaged from the collapsed roof, using joinery techniques so deeply embedded in her muscle memory that she performed them almost without thinking. She stretched oilcloth across the open roof plate of the main room to create a weather seal tight enough to sleep under. She found the hand pump at the back of the property was still functional. Her father had cased it in stone, and the stone had protected the mechanism from the fire. She pumped water, and she drank it, and she felt for the first time since her mother's death that she was standing on something that belonged to her. She took odd work in Sable Creek during those first weeks, keeping accounts for the dry goods merchant on Thursday afternoons and cleaning the schoolhouse on Friday mornings. It was enough to buy flour and salt pork and, eventually, a good crowbar and a masonry chisel, which were the tools she had decided she needed for the east wall. On the first genuinely cold morning of October, with frost still on the ground and her breath making small clouds in the ruined room, she put the chisel to the mortar between the third and fourth courses of stone at the wall's base and began to work. It took 4 hours. The mortar was old and had set hard, and the fire had fused some of the stone courses together in ways that required her to approach from unexpected angles. But her father had taught her that a wall will always tell you where it wants to be opened, if you are patient enough to listen, and she was patient. When the section finally gave way, a rectangular section roughly the size of a door, swinging inward on a clever pivot hinge her father had built directly into the stone, she sat back on her heels in the ash and simply breathed for a moment. The room beyond was dark and smelled of cedar and dust and something else she could not immediately identify, a dry, papery smell, like old books. She held her lamp up and stepped through. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, and it had been lined, floor to ceiling, in cedarwood planking that the fire had not touched, because the stone had insulated it completely. On the eastern side, her father had built a set of shelves. On those shelves sat 2 things, a cedar chest, banded in brass, and a large tin box, locked with a hasp and padlock that had rusted to a warm orange. On the floor before the shelves lay a folded oilcloth, and pinned to it with a cut nail was a single piece of paper in her father's handwriting. She reached for the paper first. It read, "For whoever finds this room, and especially for you, Nora, if you are the one, these are the records your mother kept for the Sable Creek Valley Water Compact, 1882 through 1885. She was afraid to keep them in the house after what Cornelius Vane said to her at the market in August. She gave them to me to seal away. She said, if something happens, someone will need to know the truth. The truth is all in the tin box. The chest is yours. Your mother wanted you to have it, always." Nora read the note 4 times before she trusted herself to move. The tin box required a cold chisel and considerable persuasion before its rusted lock gave way, and when it did, she sat for a long time on the cedar-planked floor of her father's hidden room with the lid open across her knees and tried to make sense of what she was looking at. The box contained ledgers, 3 of them, cloth-bound in green, in her mother's meticulous hand, and a collection of loose papers that appeared to be official notices, receipts, and handwritten meeting minutes. On top of these lay a single letter, unsealed, addressed in Clara's writing to the Territorial Land Office, Cheyenne, Wyoming. The letter had never been sent. It took Nora the better part of 3 evenings, working by lamplight at the small table she had salvaged and set up in the main room, to understand what the ledgers contained. Her mother had been the record keeper for something called the Sable Creek Valley Water Compact, an agreement signed in 1879 by the 7 families who had settled the valley, establishing shared rights to the creek and its tributaries, with annual assessments paid into a common fund used for maintenance of the irrigation channels that all 7 farms depended on. The compact had a trustee. The trustee's name, written at the top of every ledger page in her mother's precise hand, was Cornelius Vane. What the ledgers showed, what Clara Alderholt had documented with the fearless precision of a woman who had been raised to believe that an honest number was the most powerful thing in any room, was that between 1882 and 1885, Cornelius Vane had collected the annual assessments from all 7 compact families and had not deposited a single dollar of them into the shared maintenance fund. He had, instead, deposited those funds into a private account in his own name at the Territorial Bank in Casper, which Clara had discovered only because she had written to that bank, politely, on compact letterhead, requesting a statement of the fund's balance, and had received, in return, a letter stating that no such fund existed under that name. But that a private account bearing Cornelius Vane's name showed deposits in the precise amounts and on the precise dates that the compact assessments had been collected. The loose papers confirmed the rest. 3 of the 7 original compact families had eventually abandoned their farms, not because the land was bad, but because the irrigation channels had fallen into disrepair for want of maintenance funds that had never arrived, and without water, their crops had failed 2 years running. Cornelius Vane had purchased all 3 of those properties at distressed prices. He now owned, Nora calculated with a cold feeling in her chest, nearly half the irrigated acreage in the Sable Creek Valley. Her mother's unsent letter to the Territorial Land Office laid out the entire fraud in 8 paragraphs of clear, controlled, devastating prose. Clara had written it in August of 1885. Edmund Alderholt had died in September of that year, and Clara, already beginning to be unwell, had apparently decided that sealing the evidence rather than sending the letter was the safer course while she was alone and vulnerable. She had died 16 months later, and the letter had stayed unsent, and the evidence had stayed sealed. And Cornelius Vane had gone on accumulating his stolen acreage and sitting on the Sable Creek Town Council and shaking hands at church and being generally regarded as one of the valley's more successful and respectable men. Nora sat with all of this for a long time. She was not, she told herself carefully, a woman who acted from anger. She was a woman who acted from evidence. And the evidence in front of her was, by any accounting, exact. She made one mistake, and she made it out of an optimism she would later forgive herself for. Because she was 19 years old and had been raised to believe that a person presented with an honest ledger would choose to act honestly upon it. She went to see Cornelius Vane. She dressed carefully and went to his office on the main street of Sable Creek on a Wednesday morning in November, carrying one of her mother's ledgers and the unsent letter. And she laid them on his desk and explained, calmly and precisely, what they showed and what she intended to do with them. Cornelius Vane was 61 years old, heavy through the shoulders. With the unhurried bearing of a man who had never in his adult life been told something he did not wish to hear by someone he did not respect. He looked at the ledger with an expression of patient amusement, and he looked at Nora with an expression that was something less than amusement. And he said that it was a terrible shame what happened to her parents and that she seemed like a bright young woman who might benefit from the kind of practical guidance that only experience could provide. And that he had several friends on the town council who were also friends of the Sable Creek sheriff. And that a young woman living alone on an unsound piece of property with no income to speak of might find that certain municipal decisions, about building permits, property assessments, right-of-way questions, could become considerably more complicated if she chose to pursue a grievance based on documents that could not be reliably authenticated. He said all of this pleasantly, with his hands folded on his desk and a small smile that did not reach his eyes, and then he stood and offered to walk her to the door. She took her mother's ledger and her mother's letter and she walked out without another word. It was a cold walk back to the ranch, and she did not cry, but her hands shook inside her coat pockets for the entire 6 miles. By the time she reached her own gate she had stopped shaking and had begun to think clearly. Which was what her mother's training eventually did for her. It burned away the emotion until what was left was only the precise and navigable truth of the situation. Vane had 3 advantages: money, social standing, and local authority. She had 3 advantages of her own, which were smaller but potentially more durable: original documentation in a deceased woman's unimpeachable hand. The knowledge of a territorial land office that existed precisely to adjudicate this kind of fraud, and the considerable advantage of having absolutely nothing left to lose. She added a fourth: she was Edmund Alderholt's daughter, and Edmund Alderholt had never once, in her memory, failed to finish what he started building. She did not go back to Vane. She wrote instead, to Cheyenne, enclosing her mother's original letter and a detailed summary, in her own hand, of what the 3 ledgers contained, along with a formal request that the Territorial Land Office conduct an audit of the Sable Creek Valley Water Compact's historical accounts. She wrote in the style her mother had modeled, clear, precise, courteous, and devastatingly complete. She cited specific figures, specific dates, specific deposit records. She included the name and branch of the Casper Bank where she had reason to believe the funds had been diverted. Then she waited. And while she waited, she did not sit still. She went, one by one, to the 4 remaining original compact families, the Yanceys, the Beaumont sisters, the Okafor family who had come from Ohio, and old Temperance Rigby, who was 70 and still farming the northeast corner of the valley on stubbornness alone, and she sat at each of their kitchen tables and showed them what the ledgers contained. None of them had known. All of them had wondered, in quiet and private ways, why the irrigation channels had never been maintained in the way the compact had promised. 2 of the 4 had reduced their acreage because unreliable water made full planting too risky. Temperance Rigby, when she had read through the relevant pages, set the ledger down on her kitchen table and was quiet for a long time, and then she said, in the dry and measured tone of a woman who has processed a great many things alone in her 70 years, your mother was a brave woman, and she kept good records. She did, Nora said. You are also a brave woman, Temperance said. And you appear to keep good records yourself. I was taught by the best, Nora said. 3 of the 4 families signed affidavits attesting to what they had paid into the compact and what they had received in return. The 4th, the Yanceys, who were neighbors of Vane and dependent on him for a grazing lease, declined, and Nora understood their decision and did not hold it against them. The response from Cheyenne came in February, after a winter that tested every repair she had made to the ranch house and required 2 more. A Territorial Land Office inspector named Hargrove arrived in Sable Creek on a gray Tuesday morning, and he spent 4 days in town. And on the 5th day he visited Nora's ranch and sat in her main room at her salvage table and examined her mother's ledgers for 3 hours and said very little until he had finished. At which point he said, Miss Alderholt, I have been doing this work for 11 years, and this is the most carefully documented case of compact fraud I have seen in that time. Your mother was a remarkable woman. She was, Nora said. What happens now? What happened was this: Cornelius Vane was formally charged with misappropriation of compact funds by the Territorial Court in April. The case was not long. The ledgers were definitive. The bank records from Casper confirmed what the ledgers showed. Vane's attorney argued that the documents could not be authenticated, and the territorial judge, a precise and unsentimental woman named Judge Arlene Marsh, asked the attorney whether he was suggesting that a dead woman had fabricated 3 ledgers worth of detailed financial records from beyond the grave. And when the attorney did not have a satisfying response to this, Judge Marsh moved on. The judgment required Vane to repay, with interest at the territorial standard rate, the full amount diverted from the compact fund across the 3 years in question. The amount, with 14 years of interest compounded, was substantial. Beyond that, the territorial court ordered an investigation into the 3 property purchases Vane had made from distressed compact families, and found that in each case, the distress had been artificially induced by his own theft of their maintenance funds. The court ordered the properties returned at the original sale price, adjusted for any improvements Vane had made. He retained his own original land. The court could not prove he had intended the fraud as a land acquisition scheme. Only that he had benefited from it, but it was considerably less land than he had grown accustomed to managing, and the town of Sable Creek, which had regarded him as a pillar of its community, now regarded him as something rather different. He did not go to prison. The law in 1888 Wyoming was imprecise on the question of civil compact fraud, and Judge Marsh was careful to operate within what she could prove. But Cornelius Vane, who had built his standing in Sable Creek on the appearance of trustworthiness, found that standing to be a considerably more fragile structure than he had supposed. He resigned from the town council in May. He sold his cattle the following autumn. Within 2 years he had relocated entirely to Casper, where he was not known. Which seemed to Nora, and to most of the valley, to be a fair enough outcome for a man who had arranged the ruin of 3 families through patient dishonesty. The restored compact funds, administered now by a newly elected board that included Temperance Rigby and Naomi Okafor and, at the board's unanimous insistence, Nora Alderholt herself, were used over the following 3 years to rebuild every irrigation channel in the valley. The 3 families who had abandoned their land returned, the Dillards and the Prentice family and a widow named Gertrude Haas, who had moved to her daughter's house in Laramie and cried when the letter arrived telling her that her farm was hers again and that the land had waited for her. Nora used her portion of the compact's formal acknowledgement payment, a modest sum, but real, to complete the repairs on the ranch house. She took her time with it, the way her father had taken his time. She rebuilt the roof first, then the buckled wall, then the floor. The cedar room she did not change at all. She put her mother's ledgers back on the shelves, beside the cedar chest, which she had opened during that first winter and found to contain her mother's silver thimble, a small photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and a brief note in Clara's hand that said only, *, your father said you would figure it out. I believed him. So should you, *. She kept all of it on the shelves. She left the room's entrance open. And she went in sometimes in the evenings with her lamp and sat on the floor in the cedar-scented dark and thought about what it meant to build something meant to last, to build it carefully and quietly, with attention to the places where it would be tested, and to trust that even after a fire, the parts worth keeping would hold. There is a particular quality of morning light in the Sable Creek Valley in late spring. When the creek is running full from snowmelt and the meadow grass has come in thick enough to move in waves when the wind passes through. People who have lived there long enough stop noticing it, the way you stop noticing the smell of a place you love. But if you come back to it after a winter of doubt, or after a year of loss, or after the particular species of disorientation that comes from being 19 years old and put out of a house with $2 and a bag that won't close, if you come back to it with all of that behind you, it is almost too much to look at directly. We began this story with a young woman in September, standing in a land agent's office with coins sewn into her hem and a deed to a burned and worthless piece of land in her hand. And everyone who saw her believed they knew exactly what kind of story this was going to be. It was going to be a sad story, obviously. A story of a young woman who made a desperate purchase and learned a harsh lesson and eventually found some more practical solution to her situation. They were wrong about the story. They were wrong, in the specific way that people are always wrong when they look at a thing that has been through a fire and assume that what the fire left behind is only damage. Sometimes the fire seals things. Sometimes the walls that look most ruined are the ones that have protected something the world needed badly, for a long time, and simply could not get to until someone came along with patient hands and the right tools and the willingness to listen to what the wall was trying to say. Nora Alderholt was 22 years old when the last of the irrigation channels was restored, and the valley had water the way it was always supposed to have water. And the Sable Creek Compact Board met for the first time in its reconstructed form in a clean room with a window and a proper lamp. She was 23 when Gertrude Haas came back to her farm and found the vegetable garden had been turned and seeded in advance of her arrival, a fact Nora denied knowing anything about, though her boots had the same soil on them as the garden rows. She was still living on her father's land, in the ranch house that she had rebuilt with her own hands, to her father's original specifications, with one exception, the cedar room, which she had decided did not need a door to seal it anymore. She had left it open to the hall, a small and cedar-scented room lined with shelves, where the ledgers were kept and the chest sat and the note from her father was pinned to the oilcloth still. Because she was not done being reminded. The story of what happened in the Sable Creek Valley was told many different ways in the years that followed, and not all of the versions were accurate. Some gave more credit to the Territorial Land Office than it deserved. And some gave too little credit to the compact families who had signed their names to affidavits when it cost them something to do so. A few versions, in the retelling, made Cornelius Vane more monstrous than he actually was, which is a temptation understandable in any story where someone has done real harm. But which would have bothered Clara Alderholt, who believed that exaggerating a wrong did no service to the truth of it. The version Nora preferred was the simplest one. A woman had kept records. Another woman had found them. The records had said what they said, and the world had had to reckon with that, and it had. She was her mother's daughter, and her father's daughter, and she had come home to a piece of burned land that everyone else had given up on, and she had listened to what it was trying to tell her. And she had not stopped until she understood. Her name was Nora Alderholt. She had paid $2 for something the world considered worthless, and the world, as it so often is in such cases, had not known what it was talking about. If you've made it all the way here with us today, we are genuinely grateful for your company. There is something we find deeply moving about a story like Nora's, not because it is a story about triumph exactly, but because it is a story about attention. About the particular kind of courage it takes to look at a burned and broken thing and refuse to accept that damage is the whole of the story. Before you go, we want to ask you one thing, and we hope you'll take a moment with it. What is a time in your own life when you found something of real value in a thing or a place or even a person that the rest of the world had written off? We believe those moments matter, and we believe the people who had them deserve to be heard. Leave your answer in the comments. We read them, every one. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need it, someone who is standing in front of something burned and wondering whether it is worth the bother of beginning. And if you haven't already, subscribe and stay with us, because we have many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Until next time, stay close.